We are now happy to be joined by Katie Strang. Katie, first of all, it's been way too long since you've been on the podcast. A long time. I just wish you would write something notable or worthy of a conversation on the Athletic Hockey Show occasionally. That would be helpful. If you haven't read it yet, listener, Katie and Haley Salvian wrote an incredible story on the Harvard women's hockey team. Coach Katey Stone, the hazing, there's the culture, the weirdness. There's so much weirdness around that story, which I want to get into. But first, as tends to happen after Katie files something, there's a follow-up investigation. News emerged yesterday, I believe, that Harvard has hired law firm Jenner & Block to conduct a review of its women hockey program. A lot going on, Katie. So first of all, thanks. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And just to, pump the tires of my co-author on this piece, Haley Salvian was such a force in reporting this and so essential, I think, to our understanding of so much of the context of this piece. She has such a good reputation in the hockey world. I could not have done this story without her. So shout out to Haley Salvian. But yeah, so significant development on Monday in that, about a week and a half after our initial story dropped, we learned that Harvard had hired a pretty prominent, white shoe law firm out of Chicago, Jenner & Block, to conduct an investigation into concerns within the program. This follows, our story, which, contained allegations of, an abundance of different types of misconduct. So hazing, insensitivity to, mental health issues, mishandling injuries, what I would categorize as verbal and emotional abuse, mental manipulation, and just a pretty general toxic environment within the team culture.
Yeah. So I think what struck me about the follow-up news, and we'll get into the meat of the original story in a second, but I was like, oh yeah, I thought we already investigated this, Harvard. And right? Hey, maybe that first crack at it wasn't so thorough, apparently.
Yeah. And I actually talked to a hazing expert on that who used to serve, in fact, as a faculty athlete representative. And he talked about, the impropriety essentially of conducting a review in that fashion, right? There's no buffer between the institution and the investigation. Now they were very reticent to call it an investigation. They called it, conversations and a review. But I mean, certainly talking to players that participated in that was a concern for them, that, it was difficult for them to feel like they could speak freely and open up and be honest without, this ever-present fear of reprisal and retribution. So, I think, yeah, Harvard took a crack at it in that fashion. I don't think that review was sufficient. And so now I don't think it's any huge surprise that, they're resorting to a much more robust probe of the program with an outside firm.
This is maybe kind of a basic question, but it's something that's stuck with me, especially reading your story and, seeing how it's kind of unfolded over the last month or however long. What is it about Katey Stone that's given her cover for these actions? Why has the response not just to your story, but previously? Why has the response? Why do you think the response from Harvard has been so muted? Because these are things, whether it's hazing, what certainly seems like emotional abuse, total lack of success on ice in the recent past. What is it about her that's given her cover over the last however many years? Because it's hard. It's from the outside, it's hard to see. What's the draw? Why does anybody like her?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are layers to that answer. She has underwhelmed in terms of on ice success recently. But, there were times, especially early on, where, she was a successful coach and someone who was really adept at leveraging the school's, academic pedigree and its deep source of alumni to entice some of the top players at the school. When she came on the scene and she was hired in 94, like Harvard was not this, hockey juggernaut. Like it wasn't a powerhouse. Like that was still like, the domain of like UNH and Northeastern. And she really like thrust them into prominence. So, I mean, historically, like she did have success. And then I think, part of it is almost like inertia. Like, I mean, there's like this sense of like institutional continuity with her that she has been the personification of that, the embodiment of Harvard hockey for so long that Harvard hockey has sort of been, enmeshed, inextricably linked with Katey Stone and her personality. So, and then I think the other thing is, she hasn't, from my understanding in our reporting, I don't think she takes on nearly as an active role in recruiting as she did, 10, 20 years ago. But she has done a very skillful job at, developing this like very robust, powerful group of, alumni in a network of people who support her and support the program, both, just in ways financial and otherwise. And so I think she has a lot of people, and remember that, a lot of these alumni, they're, really outstanding, like professionals, like they're at the top of their field in medicine, finance, athletics. And so I think she has a lot of powerful people willing to go to the mat for her and vouch for her. And that's given her power.
And she is, by the way, I mean, like I didn't, on ice, she's, and part of this is because she's been there for so long, but she is the all-time leader in wins in women's collegiate hockey. So I didn't mean to make it out like there's been like any real, any true like long-term lack of success, but yeah, it's fun. It's funky to see like, she's 6-13 this year. She's been like under 500 a bunch in the past. She's got horrific allegations of all sorts of abuse, like credibly levied against her for months.
And I do think it's important to like realize that, on ice performance doesn't happen in a vacuum. In fact, I don't think we should be compartmentalizing the off ice allegations with the on ice performance,
right? Because,
players have told us that essentially like part of the reason that teams fall apart down the stretch is that there's this underlying undercurrent of tension and toxicity within the room. So players are like pitted against each other. There's like some of these really toxic dynamics that really impacts the on ice performance. And so when they fade down the stretch, like, people have said that that's tied into some of the off ice concerns.
I like that the underlying part of your question, Sean, is you can almost tolerate this if they were 20-3, but 5-19. I don't know. I'm out. No,
we've seen. I mean, but that's typically the way it goes with abusive coaches. Is that if the results are there, they're tolerated. It's true. It's not. Is it right? Of course not.
Right.
But when the results start to dip, is when there's institutional pressure. There tends to be internalized pressure, whether it's from alumni or from the athletic director or from the president or from somebody other than the players to make a change. And that to me is what's like that. There's a lot of things that differentiate this from normal allegations of like, of the kind of this type. You don't see everyday coaches the programs compared to running the Stanford prison experiment, which is just evocative, mind-boggling quote from one of the players you two spoke to. But there's something about this, and something about and this is kind of what I was getting at, and I think you laid it out there. There's something about the university response to this that is so different and so far apart from things that we've seen in recent history when it comes to allegations like this. The rallying behind her is the part that is wild to me. And we've seen, especially in the last 10 years, as we've seen more and more coaches lose their job for allegations that are far less serious than the ones that she's facing. Mm-hmm. That's what's endlessly been crazy to me, as I've watched this kind of unfold in your work.
So one thing that I'm not as surprised about is like whenever I, report on situations that involve allegations of abuse, invariably, like the first story involves, the perpetrator, alleged victims, the incidents in question, etc. And almost always like the second story or the subsequent stories hone in on sort of like the institutional protectionism. And so I'm not ever really surprised when a university prioritize reputational protection over, the well-being of players. And I hope that will not be the case here. I think them hiring an outside law firm to investigate that is an important first step. However, there's a lot about this investigation that is unclear at this point. For example, I have asked Harvard, do you pledge to make the findings of this report public? Transparency is a key component to any robust investigation in terms of its credibility and potential impact. I have asked, what is the scope that you tasked Jenner and Block with investigating? I want to know if it's going to be super narrow. Are you just looking into hazing? Are you just looking into hazing within the past year? Are you looking into the broader constellation of concerns and allegations that are included in our story? Are you going to be reaching out to former players? If former players reach out to you, are you willing to interview them? What sort of confidentiality are you going to provide potential whistleblowers in this situation? Which that's what a lot of people that's the dynamic that people are facing. Another big question for me is Katey Stone going to be required to participate in this investigation? Is athletic director Aaron McDermott going to be required to participate in this investigation? I think those are really key components. We have asked Harvard to provide clarity on those ends, and we got a no comment.
We should say, just straight away, but before we get any further into this, if the name Jenner and Block sounds familiar to any hockey fans out there, they are the firm that put together the report on the Chicago Blackhawks' internal failures when it came to the alleged abuse by Brad Eldridge against Kyle Beach. So that's where you've heard Jenner and Block before.
And resulted in a $2 million fine, and
yes,
people resigning, and there were real consequences. Real consequences.
Yeah,
and like what you said, Katie, it started out as, hey, here's the story of the victim, and then it became, here's the story of how the organization tried to protect itself, and that's you're exactly like that. The Blackhawks. There is a parallel there. You said there's two things you said that struck me. One, the idea of dividing a team as a mental way to, I guess, gain control over the room, and it is a really bizarre way to operate. It's not even effective. I would like to know where, at what point do you go, if I can turn the players against each other, we're going to win a ton of games. Again, that's really bizarre to me. And then you touched on the alumni. This, to me, I wanted to read a whole story on the alumni.
Yep.
Can we just talk about the black dresses and the sunglasses and the weird,
normal person stuff behind them?
Yeah. So let me unpack both of those things.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a lot there.
Wait, remind me what the first thing was. Sorry.
Just dividing the team in half so you can try to win games as a strategy.
And, it's interesting because, one thing, let me say this, I primarily, my entire job is essentially to cover abuse and misconduct in sports. I deal a lot in sexual abuse and some really heavy, gnarly, difficult stuff. Which is not to say that I'm desensitized to it, because I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
But I am. I can
confirm that you are not desensitized.
But I deal with it a lot. And what I can tell you, and what Haley would tell you, is that we were blown away by both the scope and the scale of the trauma that we encountered when reporting this story. Stuff that just hits so hard for so many people grappling with, repressed trauma or non-repressed trauma, over decades. And so I do, want to underscore just the depth of this issue. I have heard people try to undermine some of these players' concerns and, paint them as whiny players that didn't get enough playing time and didn't get their way. There was not, we have now talked to over 36 people, players within the program, people associated with the program. There was not one person that said Katey Stone was too tough. No one's bitching about being bag skated.
Right.
No one's saying she's yelling too much. What I would say impacted players the most, for some players, the hazing was really traumatic. But what I would say was more universal was the low grade, everyday, incremental, death by 1,000 cuts, microaggressions, and toxicity. I think that's because it was harder to identify. It took on a more amorphous shape. There's more ambiguity. There's more gray. We really tried to show the spectrum of escalation in some of these behaviors so that people could understand it doesn't just start out you get thrown into a team and you're just being terrorized or tormented, that it happens very gradually and incrementally. And then all of a sudden you're in this full blown, what some people describe as the Stanford prison experiment, where you feel your every move is being controlled and monitored, and every weakness and insecurity that you have is being weaponized against you. And it is such a destabilizing force that you have a fundamental loss of your own identity, and it makes you doubt your own instincts. It makes you think that this behavior is normal. It makes you think that to be a part of this team, you must accept this type of behavior. So I have never seen this element of control within a team, down to the most absurd minutia. And then, Craig, I'm super glad that you brought up the alumni, because I was so disturbed by the fact that, in a lot of these hazing incidents and initiation nights, alumni, working professionals, grown women, come back to participate in behavior that I think a lot of the people that talk to us would describe as degrading, humiliating, and dehumanizing. That to me was so profoundly distressing and disturbing to learn. And I think it tells you a lot about the culture of the program and what is deemed acceptable and how deep some of this behavior runs. And we're still trying to unpack that, and we really wanted to write about the culture of hazing in the context of, these girls and women are part of a program where many of them have, talked about how deeply like distressing, problematic, toxic it was. And so, these factions form, players are pitted against each other. They're, some of the players that are in her favor are being deputized to, ferry information about the latter groups that are not in her favor, and like, provide morsels of information, and like a lot of stuff that I felt like really like psychological abuse, I think is how a lot of people would describe it. So, when you're in it, I think it's really hard to see how potentially problematic the behavior is. And we had a lot of those conversations with people where they'd like start talking about it. And then like, we'd be like kind of shocked by what they'd say. Mm-hmm. And then they'd be like, is that weird? And we'd be like, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's I've weird. Never heard something like that before. So, I mean, it just goes to show you like that, when you're in it, I think it's really hard to recognize. And so what I think we have is like a pretty significant group of players who have like come through that program who are grappling with what they endured and like forming different relationships with their experience there now that they have a bit more perspective and distance from being in it.
I think you definitely answered part of this already, but the naked skate specifically, why is that? I think that's central to understanding the culture here and in the story you guys wrote about it. And I mean, it's you wrote it. It's your work. Why do you think that's kind of part of the bulwark here for both the story and also the program and the environment that she's created there?
Sure. Well, one, I think it's a really important, like, symbolic thing to understand that traditions were really prioritized in this culture, and the continuation of traditions, like alumni felt deeply invested that the traditions that they helped form and, carry out were continued. And someone described it to me as that was Katey Stone's power, that she was able to provide like a bridge between players of decades past to players, present with shared experience. Now, I want to make it clear, we have not reported on any direct evidence that she directed any of this behavior or, condoned this behavior or participated. But what I mean is, like, culturally speaking, in a more global fashion, tradition and the like continuation of tradition was a main feature of this program. And naked skate was one of those things that, we have talked to people that played 25 years ago that did this, that they're still doing this. And to be clear and to be fair, there are plenty of people who thought it was fun, thought it was innocuous, thought it was benign, were apathetic towards it. There are a number of people who felt differently. And, there were some people who said, I had the option not to do it. I sat out. But hazing actually, I've talked to some hazing experts, and they've said, like, hazing is not dictated by whether or not the upperclassmen also participate. And it's also not dictated by whether or not the participation was voluntary, because in a team dynamic like that, the peer pressure is often so significant that it serves as like a coercive quality, and that, the fear of being ostracized and shunned and alienated from your teammates plays such a mitigating factor in participation. And, I think one of the things that we felt it was important to signify also was a level of institutional hubris. I mean, so one day after the Boston Globe, which did a great job breaking the story out into the open, by the way, Bob Holler's a fantastic investigative writer. One day after that story ran, and by the way, that story did contain allegations of hazing within the program, they did a naked skate. And, one player became very upset. The coaching staff was notified, and they, essentially told the team, this is not a sanctioned or permissible activity. So I think it goes to show you that, these traditions are so firmly entrenched, and there are so many people that feel so deeply invested in seeing them continue that I don't think there's a ton of introspection about the potential harm that it may cause. And I think there is such a level of institutional hubris that, they're not being forced to really reckon with some of these things that may have been acceptable or not heavily scrutinized in decades past, but are no longer considered acceptable.
And also, down the list, as far as, institutional hubris is concerned, that this is textbook NCAA, this is hazing. This is definitionally hazing based on the NCAA's own standards.
100%. And also, it's hazing's illegal in the state of Massachusetts.
That's what I'm saying. This is an act that's illegal in the state, and it's prohibited by the NCAA. And there have been serious repercussions and sanctions placed on teams for doing stuff like this, and that it's still, signed off in a meaningful way by people associated with that program. Ugh.
I wanted to highlight something you said, Katie, and this is maybe just a comment, not a question, but you talked about death by 1,000 cuts, and we've talked about this, but I appreciated how you laid it all out there, even in a way that you knew would open yourself up for criticism, you and Haley. Here's the things that the coach did. And if you read it, sometimes you're like, oh, she was asking what they were eating. That's a coach that cares about the player's diet. And she wanted them there 10 minutes early. I like that. I want my team to be prompt. You know what I mean? I think it would have been easy just to have been like, hey, naked skates and whatever. But then you just start to add it up. I would be curious. Go ahead, Jeff.
It's the most effective illustration of the danger of microaggressions that I can remember reading. Because those things, like Craig said, taken out of context, taken in a vacuum, hearing that, she said she did thing A or did thing B, it's easy to, even if you're acting in good faith, if you're not a person who's coming into this looking for problems, you can see that and think okay, that sucks, but you're divorced from context, maybe to understand it. And that to me is of this story's many successes, that's at the top of the list, is kind of in a TikTok almost sort of way. You get the sense of the erosion of the sense of self, honestly, for a lot of these girls. So, and that's not a question. That is absolutely just a comment. but that's a tough thing to get across, I think, in coverage like this, because people hear microaggressions, they hear that term, and they automatically, especially bad faith actors, then snowflakes is not going to be far behind, right? That's the trigger word for those kind of people, and it's tough to illustrate that effectively sometimes. And I think you guys managed that in the space you took.
Well, thank you. I mean, that credit to our editor, George Dorman, who's brilliant in helping, guide us and shepherd us through these stories. I mean, that was certainly a central focus for him. Like I said, we felt showing the more egregious examples was important, but also the banalities as well, in trying to show the spectrum of how behavior escalates till it, becomes this environment that is so all-consuming that, for some players, they had to you know, I listen, I do think that some players had really positive experiences. I do. We've heard from multiple, and I believe them that they had positive experiences, and I'm happy for those people that did. But there are many people who did not. And, you know, I think for a lot of people, they just felt like they had to survive. And then I think there were some people who did the risk calculus in their head and thought, I can't survive actually in the context of this team. And as a result, they left. And which is part of why, you know, we did focus on the attrition, and especially recently that, you know, there have been a number of players who've walked away, and we certainly talked to a number of players that felt like it was necessary to walk away to preserve their own mental health. That, you know, multiple players said they had to take a year off of school to focus on their mental health. I mean, multiple players discussed, you know, dealing with and grappling with potential self-harm. And, you know, to everyone that thinks like that, again, that this is just a few players who can't take healthy criticism, this is not that.
It also, and also, like, as far as the hazing stuff is concerned, like, of course there are people that are okay with it. That's what makes it hazing. That's what hazing is. It creates another group of people that, you know, it warps people's, you know, like barometers on that sort of stuff, and then they do it again, and it continues.
So one fascinating conversation I had with a hazing expert, which was illuminating but also surprised me, was she was like, "Oh yeah, actually, alumni participation in hazing is quite frequent, especially like in the Greek context." And she's like, you know, when, especially like in a sorority or a finals club or a team setting, like so much of your identity is, you know, entrenched in terms of your participation with that group. So like, you know, you feel you have had something done to you, and then you have probably at one point of this cycle been a bystander, and then perhaps at one point of this cycle you've been a perpetrator, and you feel like it is your duty to pass this along. And that, you know, whenever we hear talk of like, you know, family or like team first, that, you know, that signifies that the sense of community is sort of central to this idea of belonging, that these are my people, this is my tribe, this is my culture. It is incumbent upon me to make sure that, you know, all these traditions and customs of that community continue. And so in that context, alumni participation perhaps shouldn't be particularly surprising. Mm-hmm. However, I still find it, like, I mean, I was gobsmacked by it.
Is there anything else about the story that you want people to understand that, you know, that maybe as it's surfaced and been circulated and been talked about or commented on, like that has jumped out, you'd be like, hey, you know, I want you to realize this.
I mean, you know, we try to report every story with nuance. And so I think there are a number of people who had really positive experience with this program. And I know that there are a number of people who had negative experiences with the program. I think there's a number of people who had positive experiences, but have the depth of understanding that other people's did not. But I guess, you know, one of the hurdles for us in reporting this story was people are scared of speaking about this because their fear of retribution and reprisal. And I think to some degree, you know, I don't think anyone's scared of like Katey Stone knocking on their door or calling him up. I think there's some people that are, you know, scared of, you know, potential, you know, Harvard's a powerful institution. And so I think some people are scared of that potential ramification. But I would say by and large, one thing that has struck me is that I think there's this fear of like being excommunicated by people that were your friends and teammates. I think the real fear is that like you're cut off from a lifeline of your community. And so I do think we're seeing like real division there right now. I think there are some people who are really reflecting on their experiences and being open-minded and listening to others. I think there are some that are not. And I would just caution people, to remember that, what we have encountered here is a great deal of harm and trauma and suffering. And maybe some people have said, I think that's a minority, but to me, it's like, well, how many do you need?
Yeah. How many is okay in that scenario?
How many is okay?
If somebody's listening and they wanted to reach out to you and share their story, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah. Email Katie@theathletic.com, or you can reach out to me on Twitter. My DMs are open. Haley has, I think, her contact info as well. But, we are pursuing follow-up stories on this. There's a lot there to unpack. And we plan to keep going as long as we need.
Well, thanks for joining us, Katie. Thanks for your great work on the story. All the work you're doing constantly.
Thanks for having me, guys.